For 13 years, the Caldwell Mill treated Nora's property line like a private junkyard, burying her fence in tons of twisted, worthless steel. The law wouldn't help. The town looked away. So, Nora stopped complaining. She started picking it up, and she turned their trash into a $250,000 empire. The screech of metal on metal usually started around 3:00 a.m. It was a sound like a freight train grinding to a halt, loud enough to rattle the cheap window panes in Nora's bedroom. She would lie awake in the dark, staring up at the familiar water stain on the ceiling, listening for the inevitable rhythm of the night shift. First came the distant, high-pitched whine of the heavy-duty forklift. Then the backup alarm. Beep, beep, beep. Then the crash. Another half-ton of defective corrugated steel dropped without a second thought at the very edge of the Caldwell stamping lot. Technically, the mill was supposed to keep its scrap pile 50 yards back from the property line. Technically, they were supposed to haul it away to a recycling smelter once a month. But recycling cost money in freight, and the mill's manager, a man named Richard Cobb who drove a pristine white truck and never wore a hard hat, was paid bonuses for keeping overhead low. So, the pile grew, and it crept. Over 13 years, the jagged mountain of galvanized gray and oxidized orange had slid down the embankment, crushing Nora's barbed wire fence and bleeding directly into her north pasture. Nora didn't have the money for a legal fight. She was 42, running a 50-acre cattle operation that had been bleeding cash since her father died. The herd was down to 20 head. The tractor was held together by aftermarket parts and prayer. She had tried the official routes. It was an exercise in rural bureaucracy that left her bitter and exhausted. She called the sheriff's department. A deputy drove out, nudged a piece of twisted barn tin with his boot, and told her it was a civil matter. She called the county environmental office. A bored clerk informed her that since the steel wasn't a chemical hazard or leaking oil, they couldn't force a cleanup. She even hired a cheap lawyer from 2 towns over to write a cease and desist letter. Cobb ignored it. The following week, the forklift dropped a massive, tangled spool of rejected roofing right on top of a wooden fence post, snapping it in half like a toothpick. They knew she was powerless. That was the part that burned the most. Caldwell Stamping was the largest employer in the county. They paid the taxes that paved the roads. Nora was just a failing farmer on a struggling patch of dirt. She was collateral damage. By year 10, the encroaching metal had consumed nearly a full acre of her grazing land. It was a death trap for the cattle. Jagged edges of sheared metal lay hidden in the tall summer grass, waiting to slice open a calf's leg. Nora spent her evenings walking the perimeter, hauling the loose pieces back over the property line, cutting her hands through thick leather work gloves. But for every piece she threw back, 3 more appeared the next week. It was a war of attrition, and she was losing. The turning point didn't come from a dramatic confrontation. It came from sheer, humiliating desperation. It was mid-November. The cold was setting in, biting and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones of old farmhouses. The roof on her main loafing shed, where the pregnant cows sheltered during the winter, was rotting through. The previous night's rain had turned the dirt floor into a muddy, freezing soup. Nora drove to the bank in town. She sat in a sterile, brightly lit office across from a loan officer named Todd. He couldn't have been older than 25, wearing a suit jacket that bunched at the shoulders. He looked at her financials, looked at his computer screen, and folded his hands. "I'm sorry, Nora," Todd said, his voice dripping with practiced corporate sympathy. "Your debt-to-income ratio just doesn't justify a line of credit right now. Have you considered, well, maybe selling a parcel of the land?" He meant the north pasture, the one bordering the mill. The one Caldwell Stamping had been trying to buy for pennies on the dollar for years to officially expand their scrapyard. Nora didn't yell, she didn't cry. She just stood up, walked out to her truck, and drove home. She parked by the barn and walked out to the fence line. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening sleet. She looked at the mountain of metal, thousands of sheets of corrugated tin, standing seam panels and thick industrial steel. Some of it was blindingly shiny, discarded because the crimping machine at the mill had misaligned the ridges by a fraction of an inch. Some of it had been sitting there for a decade, weathered into stunning, mottled patterns of deep rust and muted grey. It was trash. It was the bane of her existence. But as the freezing wind whipped across the pasture, rattling the loose pieces against each other, Nora stopped seeing a junkyard. She saw a roof. It was on her property. The mill had abandoned it here. It was hers now. Nora started at dawn the next day. She fired up the old John Deere, backing it right up to the edge of the metal avalanche. She wrapped a heavy tow chain around a massive, crumpled stack of 20-gauge roofing sheets that had spilled over a dilapidated section of her fence. When she dropped the tractor into gear, the tires spun in the mud, shrieking as they fought for purchase. Then, with a loud metallic groan, the pile shifted. She dragged the tangled mass of steel across the pasture and into the open space in front of her barn. That was the easy part. What followed was brutal, punishing physical labor. The sheets were bent, folded over themselves like crushed soda cans. Nora bought a 15-pound sledgehammer and an anvil from a farm auction. She set up a crude workstation just inside the barn doors. She would drag a sheet of discarded tin to the anvil. She'd find the worst of the creases, raise the hammer, and bring it down. Clang. The sound echoed off the wooden walls of the barn. It was deafening. It rattled her teeth and sent shock waves up her forearms. But with every strike, she felt a microscopic fraction of her anger dissipate. She wasn't just flattening metal, she was beating her own helplessness into submission. Clang. That was for Todd at the bank. Clang. That was for the sheriff's deputy. Clang. That was for Richard Cobb. She didn't need the sheets to be factory perfect. They just needed to lay flat enough to overlap. Over the next 3 weeks, Nora lived in a state of perpetual exhaustion. Her knuckles were bruised purple. She went through a box of bandages, keeping the deep, ragged cuts on her fingers closed. Her shoulders ached so deeply she could barely lift her coffee mug in the morning. But she finished the loafing shed. She climbed down the ladder and looked at her work. It was a patchwork monstrosity. Silver panels sat next to heavily rusted sheets, which sat next to matte grey offcuts. It was jagged, industrial, and completely impervious to the weather. It wasn't pretty, but it was dry. 2 days later, a man named Harrison pulled into her driveway. Nora watched him step out of a spotless, imported SUV. He was wearing pristine leather boots and a designer waxed canvas jacket. She recognized the type instantly. The county was changing. The old farms were dying out, slowly being bought up by wealthy developers and remote workers from the city building, sprawling, custom barn dominiums and weekend retreats. Harrison walked up to her, pointing a manicured finger toward the loafing shed. "I was driving past on the county road," he said, adjusting a pair of expensive sunglasses. "I had to turn around. Who did the cladding on that outbuilding?" Nora wiped her greasy hands on her jeans, squinting at him. "I did. It's just scrap." "It's incredible," Harrison said, stepping closer to admire the shed. He ran a hand over a panel of heavily rusted tin, completely oblivious to the fact that it had been sitting in mud a month ago. The patina. The authenticity. You can't fake that kind of weathering. We're building a high-end equestrian center over in the next valley, and my clients are obsessed with the reclaimed industrial aesthetic. Do you have a supplier for this material? Nora stared at him. She looked at the shed. Then she looked past the barn, out toward the north pasture, where hundreds of tons of reclaimed industrial aesthetic sat waiting to be flattened. Her heart did a slow, heavy thump. "I do," Nora said, her voice deadpan. "I have exclusive access to a massive reserve. Would you be willing to sell?" "I'd need enough to cover a 6,000 square foot arena. We're paying a premium for authentic, reclaimed materials, but the suppliers in the city have a 6-month waitlist." Nora's mind raced. She calculated the square footage. She thought about the hours of hammering. "I can get it for you," she said, "but it won't be cheap. Processing takes time." They negotiated right there in the dirt driveway. When Harrison named a price per square foot, Nora had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her jaw from dropping. It was more than she made on selling 4 prime calves. That night, Nora didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad, a calculator, and a cold cup of coffee. The math was staggering. The mill wasn't dumping trash on her land. They were dumping inventory. She formed an LLC the next week. She called it Fence Line Salvage. She realized quickly that she couldn't fulfill a massive order with just a sledgehammer and an anvil. She needed scale. She needed efficiency. She took the deposit check Harrison had written her and drove past the bank, straight to an industrial equipment liquidator. She bought a used, heavy-duty sheet metal roller. It was a beast of a machine, designed to feed raw steel through massive steel cylinders. She hauled it back to the barn, wired it into her 220-volt outlet, and got to work. Her process evolved from a desperate chore into an assembly line. She'd drag the mangled sheets from the property line, power wash the mud and cow manure off them, and feed them into the roller. The machine groaned and shrieked, pressing the crushed corrugated ridges back into a semblance of their original shape. But Nora was smart enough to realize what she was actually selling. She wasn't selling roofing. She was selling a story. She was selling rustic charm. She began sorting the inventory. The pristine, shiny misprints from the mill were stacked in the modern farmhouse pile. The sheets with light surface rust were categorized as vintage wash. But the ugly, heavily corroded sheets, the ones that had been buried at the bottom of the pile since 2012, the ones Nora used to curse because they were half eaten away by the elements, those went into the premium stack. She called it Heritage Patina. She priced it 30% higher than the rest. Harrison's Equestrian Center was her first major portfolio piece. When it was finished, it looked like a stunning, century-old industrial marvel. The architect took photos, put them on a high-end design blog, and credited Fence Line Salvage for the custom exterior cladding. Within a month, Nora's phone started ringing. Custom home builders wanted her rust. Trendy restaurants in the city wanted her bent tin for their interior accent walls. They loved the slightly warped edges. It gave the spaces character. She hired 2 local farmhands, boys who knew how to run machinery and didn't mind getting cut up. They spent their days at the edge of the property, dragging the mill's negligence onto Nora's land, cleaning it, rolling it, and strapping it onto pallets for shipping. Every night, the mill's forklift would back up. Beep, beep, beep. And every night, it dumped another load of raw material directly into Nora's supply chain. She would lie in bed, listening to the crash of the metal. She didn't stare at the water stain on the ceiling anymore. The roof was fixed. The bills were paid. The bank account was growing thicker by the week. When the metal crashed now, Nora didn't hear a freight train. She heard a cash register. The secret didn't last through the spring. You can't run a thriving industrial salvage operation 50 yards from the corporate headquarters of the company, supplying the material without someone noticing. It was a Tuesday in early April. The ground was thawing, turning the cattle pasture back into a thick, clinging mud. Nora was in the barn, calibrating the heavy-duty roller. Her two hired hands, brothers named Wyatt and Cole, were out by the fence line with an angle grinder, cutting away a mangled section of standing seam roofing that had been fused together by years of rust. A shadow blocked the light coming through the barn doors. Nora hit the kill switch on the roller. The machine whined down to a heavy silence. Standing in the doorway was Richard Cobb. He looked exactly as she remembered him from the one town hall meeting she'd attended a decade ago. He wore a crisp, tailored suit that had no business being on a farm, and his boots were meticulously clean. He wasn't looking at Nora. He was staring at the 4 shrink-wrapped pallets of flattened, graded steel sitting on the concrete pad, waiting for a flatbed truck to haul them to a boutique hotel project in Denver. "You're stealing from the mill," Cobb said. His voice was flat, carrying the quiet arrogance of a man who had never been told no. Nora reached into her pocket, pulled out a rag, and slowly wiped the grease from her fingers. She didn't flinch. 10 years ago, the sight of the Caldwell stamping manager on her property would have sent her into a panic. Now she just felt a cold, hard calm. "You're trespassing, Richard," she said, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "State law says I can shoot you or bill you. Which one do you want?" Cobb sneered, stepping further into the barn. He tapped a manicured fingernail against the top sheet of a pallet, marked Heritage Patina. "This is Caldwell inventory. It's proprietary-grade steel. Our stamps are still visible on the underside of these panels. You've been siphoning it off our scrap pile, running it through this contraption, and selling it. That's grand larceny." Nora actually laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound. She walked past him, out into the pale spring sunlight, and gestured toward the property line. The rusted, twisted mountain of metal still loomed there, though its footprint on her side of the fence had shrunk drastically. "That scrap pile crossed my property line 13 years ago," Nora said, her voice dropping an octave. "I have the surveyor reports, the county maps, and copies of the 34 ignored complaints I filed with your office. When property is dumped on private land and left for over a decade, it is legally considered abandoned refuse." Cobb crossed his arms. "It's a temporary staging area. We process our recycling quarterly. You haven't hauled a single truckload out of that pile since 2013, Nora shot back. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The smell of expensive cologne clashed with the sharp scent of ozone and hot metal. "But let's play your game, Richard. Let's say it is your inventory. Let's say it's not abandoned." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her flannel shirt pocket. It was crumpled, stained with coffee, but the math on it was highly accurate. "If that metal belongs to Caldwell Stamping, then you have been storing industrial materials on my private property without a lease agreement for 156 months, Nora said, unfolding the paper. "Commercial land leasing in this county for industrial storage runs about $8,000 an acre per month. Add in the environmental fines for unlined storage of oxidizing metals, the property damage to my fence, and the veterinary bills for the 3 calves I lost to tetanus in 2018. She shoved the paper against his chest. He reflexively grabbed it. "By my math," Nora whispered, staring dead into his eyes, "you owe me roughly $1.4 million in back rent and damages. So you go ahead and call the sheriff, call your corporate lawyers, tell them you want to claim ownership of the scrap on my side of the fence. I dare you." Cobb looked at the paper. He looked at the massive mountain of liability sitting on her pasture. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving his cheeks a blotchy, uneven pink. He was a corporate middle manager who survived on efficiency bonuses. $1 million land dispute and an EPA audit would end his career before lunchtime. He crumpled the paper in his fist. He didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, marched back to his pristine white truck, and sped down the driveway, fishtailing in the mud. Nora watched him go. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The next morning, a crew of Caldwell stamping workers appeared on the mill's side of the fence. They drove steel posts deep into the ground and strung a heavy-duty, 10-foot chain-link fence running exactly along the property line. They were trying to dam the river. It was too late. The damage was already done. The mountain of metal on Nora's side of the new fence was massive. It was a 13-year deposit of corporate negligence, and she had entirely fenced it in. She owned the dump now. By the end of her second year in business, Fenceline Salvage wasn't just a side hustle to keep the farm afloat. It was the farm. The cattle operation, which had bled her dry for a decade, was downsized to a hobby herd of 5 healthy, pampered Angus cows. They grazed on the south pasture, far away from the noise and the dust. The north pasture was officially rezoned for commercial use. Nora sat in her accountant's office in late November, exactly 2 years to the day after she had beaten that first sheet of tin flat with a sledgehammer. Her accountant, an older man named Arthur, with thick bifocals, was staring at her ledger with a look of profound bewilderment. "I've run these numbers 3 times, Nora," Arthur said, adjusting his glasses. "Your gross revenue for the fiscal year is $262,000. After overhead, payroll for the boys, and equipment depreciation, your net profit is sitting just north of $180,000. Nora leaned back in her chair. The leather creaked. She looked out Arthur's window at the grey, freezing drizzle falling on the town square. She remembered sitting in the bank down the street, being told to sell her land. "Is there a problem, Arthur?" she asked, her tone entirely neutral. "No problem," he said quickly. "It's just remarkable. Your cost of goods sold is practically zero. You have zero supply chain overhead. You don't buy raw materials." "I do not," Nora agreed. "You're just picking it up off the ground." "I am." Arthur shook his head, a faint smile breaking through his professional demeanor. "Well, you're going to owe the IRS a hefty chunk this year. I suggest you look into capital investments to offset the tax burden, buy some new equipment, upgrade the property." Nora took his advice. She didn't buy a new tractor, though. She kept the old John Deere. It had character. Instead, she bought a massive, climate-controlled warehouse structure to replace the drafty old barn. She bought an automated forklift. She gave Wyatt and Cole heavy raises and full health insurance, something unheard of for farmhands in the county. The irony of her client base never stopped being quietly hilarious to her. Her rusted, bent tin, the very garbage that had nearly bankrupted her, the metal that Caldwell Stamping deemed too flawed for cheap pole barns, was now cladding million-dollar properties. A tech CEO in Austin bought 3 tons of her heavily oxidized stock to line the interior of his private recording studio. A massive retail chain in Chicago bought 5 pallets of her vintage wash tin to use as display backdrops in their flagship store. They loved the authentic rural struggle the metal represented. They paid $5 a square foot for the privilege of experiencing it. Nora gave them exactly what they wanted. She shipped the metal on custom-branded pallets, each stamped with a minimalist Fenceline Salvage logo. But the sweetest victory wasn't the money. It was the absolute, unyielding power dynamic she had established over the mill. Despite Richard Cobb's new chain-link fence, the mill couldn't stop making mistakes. Caldwell Stamping ran 24 hours a day, churning out thousands of miles of metal. The crimping machines still misaligned, the shears still jammed, the defect pile continued to grow on their side of the fence. Without the ability to let the pile bleed over onto Nora's land, they quickly ran out of space. Cobb tried to hire a commercial hauling company to take the scrap to a smelter 3 counties over, but the freight costs devoured his quarterly budget. 6 months after their confrontation in the barn, Cobb sent a junior executive over to Nora's house. The kid looked nervous, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Ms. Caldwell," the kid said, standing on her newly paved porch. "Mr. Cobb sent me. We have an excess of scrap on the lot. It's becoming a fire hazard. We were wondering, since you process this type of material, if we could establish a vendor relationship. We'd be willing to sell you our defect metal at a heavily discounted rate." Nora stood in her doorway, holding a mug of black coffee. She looked past the kid, across her pristine property, toward the towering chain-link fence. On the other side, the Caldwell scrap pile was nearly cresting the 10-foot wire, groaning under its own weight. "Tell Richard I don't buy scrap," Nora said softly. "I only salvage abandoned materials." "But we don't have anywhere to put it," the kid stammered. Nora took a slow sip of her coffee. The steam curled in the cold air. "That sounds like a civil matter," she said, quoting the sheriff's deputy from years ago. "Have a good day." She shut the door. Eventually, the mill had no choice. The weight of their own refuse compromised their new fence. One night, a massive section of chain link buckled with a sharp, metallic snap. Tons of twisted, discarded roofing steel poured over the boundary line, crashing onto Nora's property like a silver waterfall. The screech of metal on metal echoed across the pasture. Nora lay in bed, the sound vibrating through the walls of the farmhouse. She didn't stare at a water stain anymore. The ceiling was freshly plastered and painted. She listened to the crash. She heard the distant, panicked shouts of the night shift crew, realizing what had happened. They had just dumped another $10,000 of inventory directly into her lap. Nora closed her eyes, pulled the heavy-down comforter up to her chin, and smiled in the dark. Tomorrow, she would fire up the forklift. Tomorrow, she would flatten it all out. And tomorrow, she would sell their garbage right back to the world. Nora's story isn't just about grit. It's a masterclass in shifting perspective. When the world, and a negligent corporation, treats you like a dumping ground, you don't have to surrender. You can change the narrative, redefine the value of what's broken, and sell the wreckage back to the highest bidder. If Nora's ruthless, $250,000 revenge resonated with you, drop a like on this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder to fight back, and subscribe for more stories.